Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby, Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. Welcome to a bonus episode of Wake, the podcast that knows that if there's ever a substance that's required to revive the dead at a rowdy wake, it has to be the créatúr, tucked into a snug in the corner of the shebeen, giving us the appetite towards fulfilling a long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegans Wake out loud just once. I'm your host, Toby Malone, here for another special episode with my partner in the cups, TJ Young, for an episode scheduled to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Hi, TJ.
Hi, Toby. How's it going?
I'm great. I couldn't be better, in fact. I've been excited about this episode all week.
Yeah, we have been, it's been on the books we've been trying to make it work for a little bit. I'm excited that it's happening. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we wanted to schedule this for St. Patrick's Day. Before we started recording, you said that St. Patrick's Day is not your favorite day of the year, even though you ran your genetic testing through and you have 2% Irish blood.
I do, and my partner's Irish, yes.
But even so, it's not your favorite.
I mean, growing up, it's like, if I forgot to wear green that day, I get pinched and poked and punched all day, and I'm like, I'm not down for that. And then I also feel there's two holidays where I feel like the people who don't actually drink decide that that's the day they're going to.
Right.
New Year's and St. Patrick's. And I'm just like, stay home if you're going to be, unlike me, a trained drinker. I don't, there comes a point in time on both those days where I'm like, I'm not leaving my house because I don't trust the people in the cars. But
Fair
other than
enough.
that,
Yeah. I used to celebrate, but I don't drink much as much as I used to. So I always observe it. I wear an Irish rugby jersey on the day off, but other than that, not hitting the drinks so much. But it is still a good day to celebrate. And if you're a keen-eared Wake listener, you might have noticed that in past episodes, I'd suggested that the final episode of the podcast would be released on St. Patrick's Day, which felt fitting. But then we kept adding bonus episodes and we kept sort of meeting interesting people who we had to add in. And this, after the success of our Guinness episode at New Year, I decided that this was an ideal opportunity to celebrate the other side to the Irish drinking habits, the water of life, ishkibaha, whiskey. And so James Joyce enjoyed a dram of two in his time, to say the least, although he tended to favour white wine. But whiskey is all over Finnegans Wake, so we thought we'd take this opportunity to explore its presence. And to bring an air of authority to the podcast, we couldn't be more delighted to welcome a distinguished guest to Wake this week. So just a bit of context. So a little while ago, we talked about how Sarah Kane, our friend Sarah Kane, attended a filmed reading of Finnegans Wake at Sweny's Pharmacy, save Sweny, but did not go into detail about what the film was about. So today we had hoped to welcome the director of that film, whiskey expert Dave Broom, to the podcast, but unfortunately he's under the weather, so get well soon, Dave. But we are extremely privileged, though. Dave introduced us to a colleague of his, the soon-to-be Dr. Fionnán O'Connor, who is a globally recognised expert in Irish whiskey. Welcome, Fionnán.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here.
If it's any consolation, TJ, most people that I know in Dublin stay at home for Paddy's Day and let it work its way through the system.
See, it's not just me. I'm just like, this chaos out there that I want no part of.
Yes.
It's, especially in Dublin, it's like the city becomes a kind of a theme park based on the city for a day. And, it's a very kind of strange kind of simulacra of Ireland, like Disneyland Ireland, but you're also in the actual Ireland, but the actual Ireland is putting on the charade. It's
right.
Very disorientating and pretty sloppy. So I usually just like bunker down in my home for the day and crawl out when the noise is cut down a bit.
Yes.
I'm glad I'm not alone in this. This makes me feel so much better.
So we're so pleased to have you in here today, just because you are an expert as you raise your dram to your nose. The listener can't hear, but Fionnán has a whiskey there in hand, of course. That you are an expert in Irish whiskey. This is your area of passion and also area of study. You're currently just about to defend your PhD thesis. Can you tell us a little bit about what your study is covering?
Yeah, so I kind of jumped ship from academia years ago. So I was at Trinity a long time ago, and I was doing comparative lit, and I kind of had a medieval bent, and I was also really into whiskey. And it turned out, through trial and error, people were more interested in hearing about whiskey than like the medieval mapping of hell. Um, anyway, so I kind of parked academic life for a long time. I started writing books about whiskey, and then I was in Hong Kong, of all places, on this Irish food diplomacy mission for the Board BIA, the kind of food promotion board, the people responsible for flogging Irish butter on the world. Anyway, they were promoting, I don't know, Irish ingredients as much as Irish food, but Irish shellfish in China. And they brought me along for a tasting. And it was really odd because none of the whiskey was available in Hong Kong. And I didn't really know what I was supposed to do. And they said, well, your job here is to get everyone pretty merry so they sign off on all the clams. But while I was there was a chef named Martin Mokanumra, who's also leading food historian in Ireland. And he one night he said, look, do you want to skip this show and crawl around Hong Kong? And so we went out on the tiles, and then he said, like, look, if you want funding, you could do a whiskey history PhD. And this sounded like a great time when we were, however much kind of Bijou deep out, shack where there was, we found some place in the back of an alley where there were like chickens hanging outside the walls. And then I woke up back in Dublin. I thought, this is not real. This is just some, blether on the other side of the world on a night out. And then like a week later, he called me and said, oh, well, is that Fionnán with 2 N's or 1? I'm filling in the form here. You start next week. And so I ended up kind of merging the two lives. And what the thesis was about was kind of the history of Irish whiskey as a material drink. So there's a lot said about it as like an industry, or the history of an industry, or the history of excise and tax, or this or that, but not so much about like the actual liquids and the recipes that we used to make it. What in trade jargon would be called a mash bill. So like the different grains used to make it, like oats or wheat or rye, etc. And Ireland used to be covered in distilleries. They all closed down in the 20th century. And a lot has been said about that kind of industrial collapse, but I was assigned to kind of go and hunt down what they were doing and see, now that we have this kind of craft distilling revival in Ireland, this kind of tapped well. And so a lot of these, as you guys might well already know, James Joyce's father was for a time the manager of a failing distillery. So, it was in fashion for distilleries to fail. And so it's basically built around that kind of history of the liquid as something you can taste. And then we got a distillery, Boan, to recreate a bunch of these with us. So we had a great time shoveling around oats and making the booze of yesteryear. So that's kind of the summary of it.
Isn't that beautiful? What a wonderful story. And it's so wonderful when you can find a topic that you can really grab onto and you think, well, really, this is what you're going to fund me to study. And I always say that anyone who's talking about doing a PhD, as long as you're doing something that you're absolutely obsessed with, you're going to be fine. And so it sounds like you hit on the right thing. And you've written a couple of books, A Glass Apart and Créatúr. Yeah. Are they sort of emerging from your scholarship?
So the first book, A Glass Apart, was a while ago, and that was before the PhD. So that was when I kind of jumped ship from academia the first time and started writing about whiskey. And that was on a type of whiskey in particular, a type of whiskey called single pot still, which is a very unique type of whiskey. So you have single malt whiskey, which is made of malted barley. And then in Ireland, we used to have this stuff called Irish pot still. It's now, the modern name is single pot still. And they would mix in raw barley, which is pretty crap at making alcohol, but makes the liquid very, very oily. And a lot of Irish whiskey used to be very, very dense and very kind of creamy or viscous and that kind of fell out of fashion. It became kind of an old man's drink. And now people want, in the same way people have come back for IPA and these kind of more aggressive drinks, people want these kind of, beefy, fatty, spicy whiskeys.
Right.
And that was where a lot of But it used to be, so now it's made with raw barley, but it used to be raw other stuff as well. And so they would throw in like oats and rye. And so that book kind of was a pop whiskey book, but it kind of opened the door. And it was about that topic that I ended up talking to Marcin at that bar in Hong Kong. And he said, oh, well, look, if you want to chase that topic down. And as you say, like, that's the thing with the PhD, find some odd topic that you're excited about. That's kind of, and that was it was like, so that, and then Créatúr is the new book, and that's still in the works. And it very much inspired by the findings of the PhD, but in a way that, you know, is kind of marrying that back to kind of whiskey writing in a pop sense, you know. So
yeah, that's great. That's great.
From the thesis, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, no, it's wonderful to be able to find a place for that kind of work. And Dave, who was supposed to be here, he wrote the World Atlas of Whiskey, or he's a great expert in the area. We'll make sure we promote his book and all of and your books or your existing book and your upcoming book in our show notes, just to make sure that we move some units, because I think this stuff is really exciting. I mean, it's the sort of thing that I think a lot of people take for granted. I think if you were to say to any North American drinker that about the fall and then the recent rise of Irish whiskey, that would be something brand new news to them. I think most of them just assume it's all been very, very consistent. The history of Irish whiskey is mentioned a lot throughout Finnegans Wake. The phrase, so whiskey comes from the Irish Iscibaha, or the water of life. And that phrase there is referenced at least 9 times in the Wake, with a lot of different corruptions. Uski Borham at 24:14, Erskutski at 70:30, Iski Bausch at 91:28, Uski Beek at 157:06, Uski Borched at 319:04, Oscar Vorther at 326:07, Bogus Queethers at 476:36, and Lusky Bout at 541:19, and the best one, 585:23. He says whiskered bow, which is beautiful. He loves a pun, does old JJ. Yeah. So just give us a sense of that history of Irish whiskey. So this is something that traces back to the 12th century. Is that?
So I mean, there's a lot of guff around the history of Irish whiskey, and which is great for Finnegans Wake. You know,
yes.
Again, you know, there's as much non-history as, and I kind of have to wear 2 hats with this, because obviously, like, from the academic side, you're always kind of trying your best to get past that stuff and tell kind of, you know, real history or defensible history. But there's something kind of haunting about the fact that so much of it is just bullshit on bar stools, you know, and you'll never hear more kind of like sanctimonious pub stool wisdom than when talking about whiskey, you know, the kind of people kind of leaning in to tell you some nonsense. And I love it. I'm here for it. You know, I think it's great. And I think whiskey has kind of displaced itself from a lot of that kind of oral contact. And actually, while we're pushing Dave's stuff, if people are looking for his books, there's a great one out recently as well, A Sense of Place, which for me was a real different kind of whiskey book. It was a real game changer in terms of the way that the drink is written about, because he was talking about these kind of oral histories and bringing it back to a kind of a thing made by humans. Whereas a lot of the way the industry likes to talk about itself is either the history of brands or, you know, again, tasting notes. But the brand histories are also kind of part of where the problem is, that a lot of the history you'll find out there is told by people selling whiskey, you know.
Right.
And so there's a lot of kind of, you know, that kind of language around it. If you're going to trace it back in real terms, so, you know, distillation, where you boil something, it evaporates into a vapor, and then you cool it back down into a liquid. So that is one history. And then there's the history of the distillation of alcohol, specifically of putting in a fermented drink like wine or beer or something, and boiling and condensing back that. And so the history of distillation it can be quite speculative. The history of alcohol distillation is a little closer. They're like the first really good evidence we have for the history of identifiable booze distillation is in northern India, just Indus Valley, actually modern Pakistan, a place called the Gandhra region. And But you see it pops up in China, pops up and so forth. So, it spreads in this kind of way. The way it gets to the West is really through this kind of Arabic influence in the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, you get sometimes called the Little Renaissance, where you had a lot of Arabic learning coming into the West. And a lot of Greek learning coming from the Arabic world back into the West, because a lot of that stuff had been lost after the collapse of Rome and had actually been preserved in Islamic libraries. And so you get this influx through these kind of key points. The University of Salerno in just south of Naples is one of them. Obviously, Arabic Spain, Andalusia is another. And you start seeing these figures like Avicenna, Averroes, all these Razes, all these Arabic thinkers. And we start, anytime you have al in something, it's a giveaway for Arabic. So, alchemy, alcohol, you can see the language in there. And that kind of technology disseminates itself across Europe. And again, there's a lot of blether about how this happens. One of the great pieces of non-history is that Irish whiskey was brought to Ireland by monks, which is absolute trash. But it stands to reason, because it's it's not that it happened, it's that Ireland wants it to have happened. It's very, very kind of Wakean in that way too, that it's nonsense, but it sounds truthy. It sounds like it happened. The monks brought it, but the Irish monasticism, the kind of Celtic cross stuff was way over by the time, that was already ancient by, the time of this 1300s diffusion of distillation across the West. And where you do see it, so the first really actual hard surviving manuscript evidence is from doctors in Ireland, from this medieval Gaelic medical class, and sometimes referred to as olives, and olive, OLAMH, also the name of a wonderful kind of experimental trad jazz kind of post-rock band, if anyone's ever seen the Olam. But it's occasionally referred to as a master of things, but it became very tied to this medical class, and the term that's used for liquor, for hard liquor in Europe, is aquavita, water of life, and that term originally kicks off in Italy. And the earliest we can find is an alchemist named Taddeo Alderotti, and he refers to it as water of life. And his manuscript, the first reference to distilling in Ireland is something called the Red Book of Ossory, and you'll sometimes see this talked about as the very first reference to whiskey, but it's not actually. It's a copy of Alderotti's Consilia Medicinale. It's just a piece of European learning that's been copied down in Ireland. And so when people ask me, well, was whiskey invented at what time, or was it the Irish or the Scots? It's really that history of ideas that makes its way across, and that's the truth, rather than this kind of story of spontaneous invention, and then it adapts itself to Irish life very, very fast, and more so than in Britain or in many other parts of Europe. Spirits become a kind of a popular beverage in Ireland really, really early, to the point where English commentators remark on it. You have these colonial authorities like Fynes Morrison and these people, Richard Stanihurst, who claim that this is something they knew what aquavita was, but in England it's more of an apothecary substance. It's not something people are drinking at feasts. And again, Ishka Baha is itself just an Irish translation of aquavita, in the same way that French eau de vie, or in Scandinavia there's a liquor called aquavit, which is obviously from the same root. So it spreads its way out, and then it adapts to materials. So whereas the French distilling tradition is largely from wine or fruits, or up in Normandy apples and pears, here it starts out as wine, but very quickly wine is hard to come by, whereas ale is locally makeable very, very quickly. So it becomes a kind of a grain spirit just by circumstance and resources, and then they all kind of, so it follows that family tree, and then becomes this very agrarian activity in Ireland. And you get a huge history of home distilling, where it starts to take on almost like the properties of a currency, where you're taking something, beer goes off, whiskey doesn't. So if you distill something, you can keep it, and it becomes a kind of a commodity in and of itself. So there's a whole clandestine industry that arises very, very quickly, and you get that whole history of illicit whiskey making, poaching, from little pot still. And then on the other side, you get the kind of tax-paying history, and that becomes the built distilleries, and it becomes the history of whiskey with a capital W. And so that's kind of the
And so the decline of the industry, which would have been mostly the decline of failing businesses more than anything else. I mean, getting to the point where there were only two distillers or two left in the 1970s. Which is sort of unthinkable to us now. Do you think about the prevalence of Irish whiskey in liquor stores now? But was it just poor management or an over leveraging of resources, or what?
Both. I mean, it was a kind of a perfect storm of circumstances, and again, any one of them would do harm. The one that often gets brought up is that the Irish declared independence at more or less the same time the US declared prohibition, which was a kind of unfortunate coincidence. Huge market cut off, and then the British Empire was a quarter of the globe, and this is before you had like a Japanese market for whiskey, or it was really the British Empire was kind of one of the only games in town. But also, to be honest, there was a lot else going on. There was poor management. The Irish Free State government taxed the hell out of it, really, really put the screws on them, and that didn't help. And then we had a trade war with Britain, and that didn't help. And then blended Scotch was really coming into its own abroad, and I think Scotch understood branding in a much better way. You look at these old ads for Johnny Walker and Dewars, and they became brands, and that's the real history of the 20th century, is branded commodities. That a Johnny Walker, no matter where you have it in the world, will always taste like a Johnny Walker and will always look like that. And Irish whiskey didn't keep up in that history. So there's a lot that went wrong. It all kind of went wrong at once.
But I guess the Celtic Tiger and the growth of the revival of the Irish economy, it's now considered the fastest growing spirit in the world, Irish whiskey. At least I read somewhere where something like 38 different distillers working right now in Ireland. Whether or not that number is accurate.
Yeah, so it's 48 at the moment.
48. Wow.
For the international spirits world, this week is not looking great, but as a general trend.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I apologize.
But anyway, yeah.
But that's but still, I mean, going from 2 in the 70s and over 40 years to build up to nearly 50 is quite incredible, and shows that real appetite for it. I mean, I think a lot of people who are casual drinkers may struggle to identify the difference. I mean, if you had to explain to an idiot the difference between Irish and Scotch whiskey in terms of its, obviously there are different ingredients and made in different places and different processes, but I mean, how would you differentiate between those two drinks?
I'd put it this way. I mean, the only real definition that holds is that one is made in Scotland and one's made in Ireland. There's a lot of Irish whiskey that tastes Scottish-esque, in that it's peated or double distilled or has, because there's no prohibition on how you make it. Right. But there are trends, and there's big trends. So like, in Ireland, again, that stuff I was talking about before, single pot still would definitely be the kind of the most peculiarly Irish type of Irish whiskey. And it's very oily and it's very spicy. It tastes very musty. It's almost like a kind of a gingery kind of spice mixed with this just very, very thick distillate. And that's a very Irish thing, but it's only a part of Irish whiskey. But it is a very, very Irish part. And similarly, like not all Scotch whiskey is peated, but you have your Lafroigs that are very Scottish and very, so it's almost like taking two kind of graphs and then you overlay them and you'll see quite a bit of overlap, but then you'll see these big peaks of extremities, right. And certainly, again, there's a lot of whiskey being made both in Scotland and Ireland now that tastes very different to what's ever been done, and that's exciting too. That there's that whole kind of like, experimental side of the process, and certainly even for us in Ireland, because the whole industry collapsed and because of all of that disappeared. That like either you have, so like when Dave was here doing his film, we went out to the old abandoned John's Lane distillery. Well, it's not abandoned; it's now an art school, but it's no longer a distillery. And and the stills are still sitting out there. And we tried some old John's Lane whiskey, which is full of oats and is quite thick. And oats fell out of Irish whiskey in the 70s when all these places closed. And then when we did the experiments, we were putting them back in. And the idea was, well, even if we're doing very heritage traditional mash bills, it's new to us because the only other place to taste this is in like collector's items. Right. We're in this kind of strange second youth in Irish whiskey. It's simultaneously the oldest traditional whiskey country and the youngest, in the sense that, you know, most of these distilleries are new. There's a huge amount of excitement. A lot of the distillers have not been doing it that long, so they have this freedom to kind of, there's no house style, they can kind of find themselves. So it's a very fun and exhilarating time. But it's you get places, there's a big world, and Dave would be big into this. If you look, you mentioned his Atlas of Whiskey. You know, whiskey being made from New Zealand to Denmark to places that don't have a tradition of historical whiskey making, but have kind of made it their own in odd ways. So, for instance, you know, he was talking to me about a crowd in Denmark. I've forgotten the name. And I would normally remember it, but great guys. But they were doing rye distillates based on this like Danish kind of rye bread tradition, and they're saying, well, we'll just build a whiskey from here. So you get people just doing odd stuff. But Ireland is in a kind of a unique position of like, it's not just new mad stuff, and it's not repeating what it was doing 20 years ago. It's like a, you know, dwelling among the ghosts of right. HCE type figures from the past. You know, it's kind of a peculiar.
It's so wonderful to know that there is such flexibility in there and such play that's going. I mean, TJ, are you a whiskey drinker? Like, is this? Do you have any kind of relationship with Scotch whiskey?
Yeah, it has always felt like a special occasion drink.
Yeah,
you know, it's like, hey, we're busting out the whiskey. We're like, hey, either we're going to talk about life in a very real way, or we're celebrating a very big accomplishment. I actually have some in my liquor cabinet right now that I'm looking at, but the label's turned away from me, so I couldn't tell you what it is. But even that was like gifted to me, right? Mm-hmm. It's not something that I often go out and buy for myself, because, you know, when I started drinking, it was, what's the cheapest thing you can grab, and how can you drink a lot of it? Yeah. And as I'm getting older, obviously my taste and my tolerance are changing. So I want things that are flavorful and good. But even just the world of whiskey, I'm like, I don't know. I'm always like, I don't know where to start. I don't know where to begin. I don't know what flavor profiles that I like, and like all these other things. So normally, all the whiskey I get is normally gifted to me.
Yeah, years ago, I went to a bachelor party, which was a whiskey tasting, and it was, you know, they had an expert in there, and then they had all the bottles lined up, and then all of the droppers and the water on the side, and all the different kinds of things, and it was, and it was just, it's fascinating the way that these different flavor profiles work, and how, you know, what you can get out of them by cleansing your palate and doing all the different kinds of things. It's a different kind of thing. Yeah, I agree. It is a special occasion drink for me, but you know, I mean, Fionnán, when did you start sort of first becoming interested or drinking this stuff?
God, well, before I go on, Stawning, that was the day it popped into my head as you guys were talking. Stawning is the Danish crowd. Right. And it's funny you talk about, you know, occasion, because that was part of what drew. I started pretty young, like younger than I should probably be admitting on screen. But
it's okay. I had my first Jello shot accidentally at 12. So here we are.
Well, like, have you guys ever heard of gripe water? I don't know if that's a thing outside of Ireland, where they would give babies like whiskey, right, you know, in their gums, cut with a bit of water to stop them from crying. You know, that stuff is frowned upon now, but it used to be a way of putting, you know, simmering down the youth. But I think at a very early age, like when I did start drinking, it was with peers, and you know, you're like grimacing back some beer and you don't like the taste of it, and then you discover cider and it's a bit easier to drink, and you know, it's very much as you were saying, TJ, the kind of, you know, means to an end. And I was drawn to whiskey very Very much by the fact that it was so potent and that there was a kind of it's not, and as you say, it's not like other drinks. It is different, even as an adult, to order someone a whiskey than to order someone a beer. There's a myth around whiskey. There's a sense of occasion. There's a sense of something. If someone walks back to a table and puts 2 glasses of whiskey down, it is different. It feels different. I remember my uncle talking about proposing to my aunt. And he this was recently enough, and he said he went up to my grandfather Jack and said, well, I'm going to ask, Marguerite. And he said Jack had a cupboard and pulled out a bottle and 2 glasses. And, that sense of kind of, something is happening. There's this either a difficult talk or a meaningful talk or something happens over whiskey, but there is talk as well.
Yes.
And I really... at that time in Ireland, whiskey was a kind of an old man's drink anyway, and I was drawn to kind of dusty old stuff anyway, and stuff that was respected. And I liked a good sob story. So when I learned that, I was just flying about the industrial decay, and that it was different. I think drink makes a lot of young people talk like they haven't talked to date. And I tended to talk about the drink because it was something to talk about. I was usually very nervous and, talking too much. And I suddenly found myself rather quickly knowing a lot about what I was drinking, probably to the great boredom of anyone around me. But it was that, and I still feel that way about, even like when you go into a bar, people will say here, like, we'll have one. Nobody has one. Starts with whiskey. You've made a commitment about the rest of your evening, even if you're not drinking heavily. The idea that like we're clocking off, that something is, and how is my night? How am I going to feel in the coming hours? There's that honesty around whiskey, and I think that's tied with the fact that it's so potent. And you have to kind of be aware of its existence. Beer and even wine to a degree can kind of turn into background noise, even good beer, good wine, whereas spirits, you just never forget that you're holding it. It doesn't allow you to. It's that strong. It's not you drink it more slowly, or if you drink it too quickly, it's going to act quickly. That there's that whole just viscerality and the fact that you're never really allowed to forget. And so it carried all that with it,
Yeah, and I think
taste.
To connect it to Finnegans Wake, then obviously whiskey plays an outsized role in this book, and so it's interesting. Obviously, it's in the title. That this is set at a wake, and so alongside the Guinness that we already talked about in a previous episode, but the name of the text is based on the song that describes the death and resurrection of Tim Finnegan and the role that whiskey plays in his revival. So from the song, Tim is laid out, quote, with a gallon of whiskey at his feet and a barrel of porter at his head, or as Joyce likes to corrupt in the Wake, at 6:26 he says, with a bocalypse of Finnesky for his feet and a barrel of Guinness for his head. And then later at 1:39:8 he says, blows whiskery round his summit but stets stout upon his footies. Lots of references there. But then, of course, when Tim Finnegan's corpse is doused with whiskey, he wakes up. So really the water of life playing there. So, the idea of a wake, the place of whiskey at a wake, when we talk about an occasion, that's the occasion of all occasions, celebrating a life. Yeah.
And that idea of resurrection and the great joke, the massive piss take of the song, that the water of life, is passed around at a wake to begin with, and then is literally resuscitates, a man who died from his drinking habit, basically, getting tips falling off. So it is both his undoing and his, rebirth.
Yes. And then also the cyclical nature of what this book is, the life and death cycle that he talks about. Joyce references whiskey in clear terms at least 80 times in the Wake, and plenty of other times in fairly obscure ways. Do you have a relationship with Finnegans Wake or James Joyce yourself?
Yes, I do. So when I was a student, I actually used to volunteer at Sweeney's, so I would mind the place every Tuesday. So it was myself that put Dave in touch with them for the filming. So I know the Sweeney's crowd very, very well. PJ Murphy, and all of them. And so yeah, I've always loved Joyce. I've had a strong gra for Joyce since even before I, and like whiskey, I think I was attracted to it because I remember I have this is my grandfather's copy of Finnegans Wake, and old kind of left in a shed, smells like old book. Yeah. I remember it was around the house, and it had this attraction. And when I was young, I was quite an arrogant teenager, and as soon as someone said like this is the most difficult book there is, that was me. And of course, they weren't even talking about Finnegans Wake; they were talking about Ulysses. And right. Then I discovered the wall fell out even further. But and definitely like there was always there, and I remember because I had an aunt that was always chided because she used to refer to the book as useless. And they would use it as a door stopper. And she said, "Oh, has someone put useless in the door?" Which I think the door. But I have a great love for the text. The like eternal bad pun machine that it is. And yes. Again, and it did make a lot of sense. That whiskey would be there, or at least the way that I thought about whiskey certainly lined up with the way I thought about Finnegans Wake, and that idea of like tragedy and comedy locked in the same beverage. This solution to the riddle is and the potency and the strangeness and So look, I'm all for both.
Yeah, I mean, Joyce is he talks about whiskey a lot all the way through his works. He famously notes in Dubliners that the light music of whiskey falling into glasses made an agreeable interlude, very much sort of as part of the world.
Right, and I always thought, this is one I was actually talking with Dave about, because the whiskey industry in Ireland loves that quote. You can't walk through Dublin Airport without seeing that, and you guys probably know. Like that story, Grace, like it begins with your man falling down the stairs from too much drink.
Exactly.
It's complete. And they're like trying to coax him onto this like Jesuit retreat.
Yes.
Pouring whiskey while having this conversation. And that for me is where, where the industry kind of gets it wrong in some of its branding with some of this kind of literary references. It's like, it's not just how great whiskey is. It is that irreverence, that piss take, that mix of tragedy and comedy, that again, you can just imagine the two friends pouring it out and telling him about the Jesuits are the priests of the learned classes or men of the world like us. And, they're all going to go on this sobriety retreat and, whatever, account for their souls. But that's it, and I think there's a lot of sauce there. I think alcohol in general and what it does to people is both, can be very tragic and can be very comic, and there's a strangeness, a potency there, and
it's a big part of the world in general within most of Joyce's work. Is just part of the fabric, and so we see a lot of it within the text of the Wake, where he's talking about it both on the drinking level but also on the making level. He talks about references like talks about malt, comes up again and again throughout the Wake. He calls it mort on 31506. Obviously, mort being punning on death. Calls Mr. Mort of 31909 and malt treating at 32229. There's nearly 24 references to barley and another 24 references to wheat all the way through. So the making of whiskey is also on Joyce's brain. And the thing I wanted to bring up in this, I saw a video, one of your appearances online where you were appeared in a video where you got quite emotional about the mixture of the ingredients. So you were sort of brought to an emotional state about thinking about the different kinds of earth that come together to create a whiskey.
And I think I was a few deep when that was filmed.
I thought so.
Yeah, but but there is that sense of evaporate. It is, you're taking these different grains and you're brewing them, and then literally like turning liquid into vapor and vapor back into liquid. It is a mysterious looking process, and Joyce, had a reasonably technical understanding of the process. There's enough in jokes. Again, obviously his father was connected with the Phoenix Park distillery. So had some, as far as I can tell, there's that bit in A Portrait of the Artist where Stephen's asked, what does your father do? And he has this long list. He's like, he's a gentleman, a tenor, a boatman, a blah, 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 praiser of his own past, and something in a distillery. And as far as I can tell, that's the only thing close to a job is this thing in a distillery. And even that went belly up.
Yeah.
But he does seem to, uses terms like worm and, understands that.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, at 182.09, he talks about whiskey as a tincture, using that kind of phrase. At 355.06, he talks about the still head in the distillery. And on 2 occasions, he refers to it as pure mountain dew, which is at 95.25. And then the Mountain View, 136.36. At 150.02, he says, will you put up at 3 of Irish or 3 cold Irish, which is 3pence worth of Irish whiskey and cold water, which is in reference to the 3 Fenians hanged in 1882 for the Phoenix Park murders, which is a major earwicker stomping ground. So there's so much that sort of comes around here. I mean, the other terms he uses include Caftan's wineskin at 187.08, 3-star monothong at 424.34, which refers to 3-star whiskey, and then typical corruptions like Waskell at 556.27 and Wispy 632. Although I have to say, my favourite reference to another name for whiskey that throughout is the incredibly evocative créatúr, which I love this term. He uses it 3 times, refers to whiskey as dearer than all, first warming creature at 101.31. And then in reference to the Finnegans Wake song with diddled he daddled a drop of the cradler on delight at 3:15.02. And then later discusses a character veritably complussed by thinking of the crater of some at 4:10. So can you tell us about this term? Obviously, this is the term that's title in your next book, but it's so evocative. Just tell us about the créatúr.
Yeah, and again, I love it for that reason, that it is evocative. It speaks, so it's from creature literally, and when you hear like people say, it's kind of old man's Hiberno English. He's awful fond of the créatúr. It's full of implication and kind of, the dark side of drink, but also this idea of like guilt. But then similarly, it's soaked in like Irish cliche. I mean, that whole song Finnegans Wake is loaded with cliches and this kind of mickety do whatever. A drop of the créatúr every morn, and that's whiskey too. That kind of farce, and it's all these things at once, and this idea of like something created. And it for me it's my favorite nickname for whiskey there is. That kind of duality is part of that sense of there's something more than a drink, that the créatúr is and even again that idea of something created of a spirit. I mean, even the words, I think spirit is already an interesting word, but it's lost its potency because people don't think spirit when they say, wines and spirits, whatever. It's kind of faded into the background. Créatúr isn't quite there yet. It still has a little kind of itch about it. So I've always, love, and yeah, it appears, again, I actually, the book in the works, the opening pages is meant to be a clipping from Finnegans Wake, the song. I was going to do it from Joyce, and I thought, no, I'm just going to look incredibly pompous if I Finnegans Wake. So I just stuck with the song itself. But it's there, and it's as fluid as the fluid.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. It's such a wonderful term. He uses a lot of these terms throughout, a lot of whiskey slang. It's very clear that he was around people who drank it a lot, or he drank it. And obviously, Joyce spent the last 30 years of his life in exile. It wasn't in Dublin at all, but he very clearly had a lot of that institutional memory built in. I mean, he talks about how references to how whiskey might be consumed, with references to the 3 tailors on 3:15.11 in reference to a tailor or a double measure of whiskey. He talks about a stinger on 3:17.01, which is a whiskey and soda, which he also refers to earlier on 2:13.04 as isker and suda. He uses Uko Suso for the Nipper Dandy on 345.24, where a dandy is a small glass of whiskey. 20 Rod Cherry Whisks at 436.22, which is for 40 Rod or a Chief Overproof whiskey. Talks about a ball of malt, 419.08, which is a large glass of whiskey with water, which I think is another really evocative one. Give me a ball of malt. And we also hear about that as, quote, Whisk Away and Mortem at 510.33. So it certainly has a really large major role to play. It's fairly important in this world, so much to the phrase where the phrase asking to look at your sore toe or taste your ghastly hot and sour at 485.09 is in reference to the decorative phrase from Ulysses, which suggests that someone would lick whiskey off a sore leg. Which someone was that hard up for drink that they would whisk. It feels like there's a real ritual to whiskey and how we drink it. I mean, has it changed how we drink it?
Yeah, I think, again, the industry does its best to make whiskey a casual drinking experience, and yet it's still, there is something just loaded about it. There is a lot of ritual around drink, and I think drink is an odd one because it is liquid, and the way that people share any drink is already ritualized, because you can't cut it up and split it in half. It's always poured out of something. There's some great stuff about trust from drink, that you're drinking out of the same receptacle, something you pour from one bottle, if it's poisoned, you're both poisoned. There's a lot, and that goes back for a very long time. This idea of whiskey as something shared, as there is something, and there's a whole kind of, even if you want to follow it down the anthropology kind of there's wonderful stuff out there on whiskey and trust in terms of people going out, in the way that when people go out and they get embarrassingly sloshed, you wake up the next morning and you're a little sheepish and you're kind of in on this together now, and you both kind of got the goods on each other, and there's a sobriety to that moment, literally, but there's heaps of stuff about the culture of people being gotten drunk as a trust building exercise. Can I trust you? Are you going to spill the beans and you have something odd to say? There's heaps of that's some of the stuff I used to do when I was doing medievalism was these kinds of feudal rituals, and actually in Ireland there used to be all these strange ideas, these kind of Gaelic hospitality rituals like koshering and coin and all these strange ideas, and a lot of them are based around drink as a trust building exercise. You get, and and it's still with us in a sense. If you and it shouldn't be, but if someone declines to drink, there's always some sort of strange. Now that's starting to fade, but if you offered to buy someone a drink and they said no, say a round, and then one person said, "Oh, I'll actually buy mine," you look at them like the fucking sociopath, and you think, because it is this kind of bonding ritual.
Yes.
There is a weird exchange, and even that way, that people order drink at a bar. Certainly, the round system is very, very deep in Ireland, and that idea of someone bought you a drink and now you have to buy them a drink, and nobody is actually buying anybody anything. This is a pure performance of generosity, but it was never about the generosity itself. It's a kind of building trust or testing,
and that's passed on in Australia. In Australia, it's called getting in on a shout. And if you get a reputation of someone who goes missing at their point of the shout, then that's maybe the worst thing you can do in drink culture in Australia is suddenly
and everyone will remember and hold it against you and talk about you. Again in this HC style, you'll get whispered about behind your back. And you'll feel the repercussions in all kinds of subtle social ways. And it's amazing to me that whole ritual that surrounds giving drink or buying drink, and that it's mixed with that potency of what drink does to you, and again it exists there with rounds of stout, but with whiskey it is so quick and so potent and so clear. So there's a kind of and I think part of it is because A, whiskey is a little more expensive, B, it's stronger, C, it just has brought in all this strange inheritance with it. It's something rich, and it feels like a more mythological kind of substance to be consuming than just Heineken or something, you know.
Even with that, just the idea of whenever someone gave me whiskey, what actually stopped me from drinking whiskey for the longest time is that initially I was like, I need to water this down a little bit. And that felt disrespectful in a way that it was really hard for me to articulate. But now I'm like, okay, I can drink it. But when I first started drinking whiskey and friends were like, just add a little water, I was like, what are you talking about? It felt like trying to dilute gold so that way it lasts longer. And I was like, or I could just learn to appreciate it for what it was. But I love the fact that it's the one drink that I feel has that type of weight and gravity to it. And it's funny because I have a bachelor party coming up, and I told the person who's organizing it, I was like, I want a bottle of whiskey there. Whatever, like, you got to make that happen. Yeah. And that felt like the big ask. Yeah. You know what I mean? Everything else I was like, yeah, whatever. But I want a bottle of whiskey.
Yeah, we'll have to revise the ask so it's Irish whiskey, just to make sure.
Yes, very true.
So, and in terms of, I mean, while it's not whiskey, I just wanted to spend a moment to talk about poitín, which is essentially Irish moonshine made from potatoes. Joyce refers to it in the Wake a bunch of times. Deep in my wine upon converted from moonshine, the foster mother, 43908. And he refers to poitín nearly a dozen times in the Wake, as well as the illicit distillery material to make the stuff. So at 8206-09, he said the miner who was carrying the worm, a handy term for the portable distillery, which consisted of 3 vats, 2 jars, and several bottles. Though we purposely say nothing of the stiff, both parties having an interest in the spirits. Let me go, potheen. He corrupts the word a bunch of times. Poteen at 8526, Pontine 41014, and Podeen steal the pogue at 632. He uses the anglicised version or poteen several times. Poteen and tea and praties and baccy and wine at 5626. Snuff chests, poteen tubs, lacrymal vases at 7730. Cack, fooey, bosh and feety, much Ernie, Gus, poteen, says you, 12522. And dolly farting, investments of subdominal poteen at prime cost, 45101. It's a spirit that has a major role to play in Joyce's consciousness, and it includes the references to love potions for Leos, the next beast king, at 46606. So, I mean, what kind of status does poitín have today in Ireland?
Yeah, it's seen a kind of a revival. I mean, even like, to be honest, actually, the idea that it's made from potatoes is a myth. Almost no poitín is actually quite difficult to make alcohol from potatoes on their own. You need some sort of enzymatic. But the fact that is there speaks to the way that poitín was socially viewed. It's like suspicious. It was probably made from spuds or some nonsense. You know, you can throw in spuds, you need no starch. But it's quite, I mean, even like modern potato vodka is a relatively recent thing historically and came from industrial processing. But most historical poitín was basically just new make whiskey. It was a cereal distillate. And then as sugar became cheaper and more available, it tended to be made of cereal and sugar, because sugar is quite good at making alcohol. And then now a lot of illicit poitín today would be sugar, basically, would be a kind of a homespun rum. In the age of like a Londis bag of white sugar, it's quite easy to get a hold of it. It's quite cheap, but it was always that idea. But you do see other stuff like apples and this and that thrown in. I'm trying to see here we have, and it usually gets handed to you in things like this. So this is an empty bottle of Powers from a pub that has been filled with poitín, because I was in the pub and there was a fella and he clearly made it himself, but he was trying to pass it off as if it was made by his brother or something. He was saying, "Oh, he'd like some feedback. I hear you're the whiskey expert, and you know he thinks this is the best poitín in the county, and he'd like an expert's opinion." Anyway, you know, you smell it, and there's always that question of like, what was this made from? And it might, you know, and I think the potatoes ties into that, you know, and there are examples where people might have thrown in spuds or whatever, but you know, it's that question, that strangeness. Now, and actually, I have a very good friend, Padraig, who's an ethnomusicologist, and he does a lot of stuff with trad music, and obviously poitín has quite a strong association with that whole scene. And he was talking to me about a publican who used to hand people punching strangers at the bar, and he said it got people to talk. And he said if you handed them some fancy whiskey, they'd probably just sit there on their own, kind of smelling it and whatever. But if you hand them a punching, you've dissolved the barrier because you've committed a kind of a criminal act, and you're suddenly both in on something together now. And there's a strangeness. You've broken down that customer publican wall, and it's again. So there's a potency around that idea that it certainly feels odd. Like I remember being given this and drinking it, out of a cup. And you're in on something, and that's
right.
Part of it, and even the name Pucheen, like Ian is like little, but as little, in like my darling little, like Colleen, little girl. So it's like my darling little still, it's a real, my teddy bear still is a very odd way to think about this apparatus for making, hard liquor. And it's funny because I remember coming across this term Putch Dew that they used in the Scottish Highlands for illicit stills, and it's a black pot, and much more kind of Presbyterian view on this activity, this kind of sinister, haunted kind of apparatus, and then it sounds very Irish. What does that say about us? Oh, my darling little still.
and then in America, I mean, the moonshining.
Yeah, my partner's dad moonshines, and that's actually how I knew I was in. And when he was like, I was like, I heard that you moonshine. He was like, wait right there, and he brought all these different flavors. But he's like, you have to try the base first, and then like here's all these other these things. And I knew that he liked me when he was like, take a jug home, and I was like, I've made it.
It's beautiful.
It's It carries that, and it's funny because even in Ireland now there's also like a legal putching category that's come up in recent years. Has become quite a kind of a cool drink, and that's fun itself. And I know some of the people who make that stuff, and there's a lot of excitement around it, but it can never really shake that kind of aura of illicit activity, and carrying the still, like the worm, like literally like a coiled pipe, the materials, And I fell down a well of like some of the Pucheen folklore, and you see the terms that are used, and like a bodun rama for the worm, which is the literally the roomy penis, like the dribbling dick, because the liquid comes trickling off that, and you see these kind of incredibly like vulgar, strange, comic terms surrounding this production of illicit alcohol, and it can be very cryptic, but it can also be very 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 kind of licentious, and I think certainly would be at home in a few of the puns in here,
Yeah, I was going to say that feels very Joycean.
Yes, very much so. He loves those. Love those things. Yeah, I remember being in Tennessee for work years ago, and it was a hipster drink. Now, you go into into these very expensive bars, and they'll sell you a glass of moonshine for $19, and you go, well, all right, okay, we're going to drink this fancy moonshine, but all different flavors and different. It felt a little bit cynical, but I don't know. I guess it's part of the culture. I mean, yeah.
I mean, there's and whiskey has that too. I mean, like the amount of banal branding that you see around and kind of like Irishiness it's part of it too. And I think one thing, like again, that song itself, Finnegans Wake, you can see it even in the 1800s. These kind of comic ballads with like Paddy got his Irish up kind of stuff, and it's there, and there's only one way through the bad joke, which is to laugh with it.
Right.
It's that is. Tweeness is such a part of the Irish experience. We've been prostituting the place for a long time. Top of the morning kind of crap. It's like, again, it's Paddy's Day weekend here. I walk through Temple Bar to get somewhere, and you just it feels awful. It feels like this fraud. But it's there,
Yeah, and I feel as though the presence of it in the wake is very authentic. I think it feels as though the real affectionate. It doesn't feel like it's a reference for reference's sake. It's part of the world. I mean, he mentions it. He references Guinness a lot and Pucheen a lot throughout the wake, but whiskey reigns supreme. I mean, partly, obviously, a major figure within this world is the Liffey, and a lot of the whiskey would have been made with the waters of the Liffey, just like the Guinness was. And we hear a lot of references. There's one reference at 4207 which talks about characters flushed with their fire-stuff-fostered friendship, which is so evocative. The idea that you have a friendship that's fire-stuff-fostered. And I think TJ and I, our friendship began over a few drinks.
Listen,
many years
there was
ago.
a time where Toby would wake up and he'd be like, "How are you functioning?" Because we went way too hard, and I'd be like, "I don't know. Youth is on my side today."
But we have that fire-stuff-fostered friendship. Yeah. I mean, whiskey's evoked all the way through. He talks about, he makes a list at 5624: flask neck, cracket cup, downtrodden brogue, turf sod, wild broom, cabbage blad, stockfish. He makes references to the burning of Marrowbone Lane Distillery in 1860. After the and at the point of when the distillery burnt down, the whiskey ran down the gutters of Cork Street. So at 122, he says, we have since Rose Distillery burned and have quaffed night's fire-furred cup. And then later at 5:33, Joyce darkly notes that a pair are getting on like Rose Distillery on fire.
On fire, yeah, I remember that one.
I mean, he really sort of loves to bring in those Irish connections. He makes another reference to a Wesleyan Bottle Riot Act, which is a reference to the Bottle Riot in 1822 at the Theatre Royal Dublin, where in demonstration against leniency to Catholics, in which missiles were thrown, including whiskey bottles. And TJ and I love nothing more than a theatre riot.
I love them so much.
Theatre riots are the best. We're both theatre people, and when the Playboy riot is a favourite of both of ours. We love that. Theatre. There's also reference to Coleman's Bell at 278:11, which is a reference to a story in which Saint Patrick commanded his disciples not to drink whiskey until after the Vesper Bell, but Saint Coleman, his disciple, misunderstood him and said he didn't drink anything at all. He worked all day in the harvest field and then dropped dead when the Vesper Bell rang.
Well, there's an example like that story is, as I was saying, like all of the monastic stuff is largely made up, and again, Patrick is way earlier than any of this, but we kind of worked its way backwards through the system, and like one of the very early surviving references to early whiskey histories is it records it's a single line, it's in a number of annals, but the oldest of those annals, the oldest genuine manuscript, is something called the Finnegan O'Connor, and it describes the death of a chieftain named Richard McGraniel in 1405 from the death of too much Ishkabaha, and it says, no Ishka Marava the Rishted, a water of death to Richard. And you can imagine the scribe like having great fun with this, well, it was to him. But it's all, that humor starts early and fast, and I think, and certainly there's all kinds of, there's a great, if you look at like even in kind of Irish language literature, there's an awful lot of piss taking around whiskey and jokes, and that again, double entendre, and whether consciously or not, Joyce certainly belongs to that kind of tradition, if you want to call it, of that kind of irreverence of embracing the joke.
Yes.
And there's even a reference about the song. I don't know if you've seen the argument, because there's Watkin Street and Watling Street, depending on the version of Finnegans Wake you hear. Yeah. And there is a street between Rose Distillery, or where it was, and Guinness. And it's a thin little alley. And in one version, that's where Tim Finnegan lives. And it's literally with a bottle of whiskey at his feet and a barrel.
And the barrel of Guinness.
I love that.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah.
So that's where his house was. He was geographically sandwiched between a distillery and a brewery.
Yeah, the brand stuff is really interesting. There's a lot of different kinds of brands of whiskeys. Because we had that. So obviously Rose came and went, but there are a lot of. And we talked earlier about how there was this great decline to the point where there are only two brands left standing. And so obviously the most famous one, and the one that sort of outlived everyone and is still around, is Jamessan, who is. But there are other historically important brands of whiskey. Some of them went away and then came back again, but I'm not sure if they were the same or if someone else is just taking the name.
They're usually so even like Roe has now become there's a new distillery owned by Diageo calling itself Rowan Co, named after the previous one. So most of these revivals are entirely new operations that have just kind of taken the name as a brand.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Powers. So the Puccin bottle you showed us just a second ago was an old Powers bottle with the word Powers crossed out, and this is Puccin, which is beautiful. I love it. You brand it that way; it's beautiful. But Powers is referenced a lot throughout. At 495.04, McGrath's Thug and smells cheaply of Powers spirits. Which is a real diss, 321.01, liquidly no more Powers to their elbow. 323.27, doomed crack of the old damn Yukonin and power in sound. At 140.34, he says more power to you. And then the geographical references, just like what you're talking about in terms of the Watling Street, he at 140.31 he says Irish in my east hand and the James's Gate in my west, which is that same reference that you made, that it's in between Guinness and Powers. Or take this John's Lane in your toasting forge at 408.33. That references the John's Lane in Dublin where Powers was. Or run him a John's Gate down James's Gate at 473.25, and the Raven and Sugarloaf, either Johns's Lame or James's Gate at 521.13.
and then they're across from each. Like, to give some sense of the geography for those who don't know, there's a street there called Thomas Street, and on one side of that you're heading toward the big Guinness apparatus, and on the other side you had Rose and John's Lane distilleries, the Powers and Rose distilleries, already next to each other. So that whole chunk of the city was literally just one big gargle manufactory. They were all quite close together. With the exception of Jamessan.
Yes, and then there were references throughout to all sorts of different distilleries. I mean, like nearly. I mean, there's 9 or 10 that I pulled out here. The last Powers one I have here is that on at 319.11 he says. He made one summary Chalk and Merble in Lone's time of his The Three Swallows, which is the 319.11. The Three Swallows is a trademark of Powers whiskey. There's also references to Johnny Walker, which not being Irish but still being a whiskey, being drunk. 210.13. Pig Iron Mittens for Johnny Walker Beg. 473.03. Only Walker himself is like Waltzer. Whimsalissimo. They go Murmurand. 526.18. What Walker John referent? And then, at 276.22, at Tam Finnegans Wake, yet he's still going strong, being the Johnny Walker still going strong, or the Foggy Doe is still going strong at 367.24. And to I mean, I don't want to make this an entire list episode, but there's so many of these references. Some of the smaller ones, Paddy's whiskey, 3 shots at Paddy at Up Saddle at 137.01, or Ginner Paddy, Got a Petty, Gussie's Gifford Ope at 231.03, Findlaters. A is the sign and 1's the number, which is 245.35. Findlater's A1 whiskey, which is sold in Dublin. The White Horse. This was his In White Horse at 510.30. The White Horse whiskey. Gilbey's by his pewter pint of Gilty's Goat's Way, which is prime consolation, albeit involving upon the same no uncertain amount of esophagus regurgitation. And we already mentioned Rose at 122.12, nor since Rose Distillery burned or getting on like Rose Distillery on fire. There's also Bushmills he talks about in terms of geography, from Neves to Willses, from Bushmills to Enos at 577.21, which is Bushmills is in Antrim. And then he also puns on Bushmills and Bismillah, or In the Name of the Lord, as we know it from Bohemian Rhapsody. He says, Us Mullah, cried Lord Wolsey, how me arty magle row at 292.03. Bushmiller at 521.15, and Bismillah Felties 357.04. And obviously this is a reference to not only the whiskey, but that Muslims are not allowed to drink it. And then finally, the last, this is a long one, but the Phoenix Park Distillery, which is where, you've already mentioned, Joyce's father's connection with our King's House of Stone, Belgrove of Mulberry, the still that was mill 265.01, because the building was originally a mill, and that fragrance of the Frazee Beds, the Phoenix, his pyre is still flaming away at 265.06. So, so a lot of small. I mean, a lot of these brands may be long gone. Maybe some have come back.
I mean, I don't know if you've seen that. So that neck of the the river where the distillery was, the only thing that really remains of the Phoenix Park distillery is the like iron frame apparatus of the water mill. So I used to call it the mill that was still that was mill.
Right.
But,
Love that.
it's, that's all that's left. I think there's a building across the road, and I went down to the car park underground, and it looks like it's foundations from the old building. But again, a lot of these distilleries have John's Lane is still there because it's a school, but a lot of them have disappeared from the landscape. So they would have been a big part of the fabric of the city at the time. Certainly when Joyce was writing, but some of them have just literally disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the most common whiskey reference in Wake is to John Jamessan and Sons. I mean, it's obviously the most popular Irish, or at least well-known, most exported Irish whiskey in the world, arguably. Brand that's recognised everywhere, and it appears on the very first page of the Wake, only 13 lines in, with a reference to "Rot a peck of Par's malt, had gem or shen, rued by arclight, and rory end the Regenbro was to be seen, rings some on the aquaface." The question I have is drinking Jameson's in Dublin kind of like drinking Foster's beer in Australia?
It's funny because it kind of used to be, and not so much anymore. So for a long time, the best-selling whiskey in Ireland was Powers.
Right.
And Powers and Jameson are owned by the same company. And they put a lot of advertising behind Jameson, and in the early 2000s, Jameson kind of got the head here and is kind of pushed. So it's common enough to see. Certainly in Joyce's time, Powers would have been the bigger brand. The more, and it's funny, you look through pubs in Ireland, and Jameson is almost invisible in pubs. Always knickknacks and mirrors and stuff from Powers, or from whatever local distilleries are in the area. But Powers is everywhere. But there was, it certainly was a prestige distillery. I think I don't know if there's any truth. Someone once told me, I never looked it up, that Joyce, frustrated at finishing Finnegans Wake, briefly toyed with the idea of handing it over to James Stephens and signing it as JJ&S. So you'd have a whiskey label for the cover.
I think Stephens was the one waiting in the wings to finish it if Joyce died before it was done. But happily that never happened.
There would have been the irony of it being a literal whiskey authorship. But yeah, so Jameson is already, it's certainly like Joyce thought it was funny. Some of the stuff like the whiskey itself, I don't know how much of this is apocryphal, but I remember hearing a story about his wallet having JJ&S. Because, of course, you have him being James himself and finding this very funny already of Jameson, blah blah blah, all the various allusions to a good man for self-reference.
He loves a pun. A pun.
So
yeah. And it comes up throughout the book, like dozens of references. He refers to the company by name. 12604, he says, Sean McIrewick, a brief dragger for the concern of Messrs. John Jamessan and Song. At 30517, and if you're not your bloater's kipper, may I never curse again on that pint I took of Jameson's. And is listed amongst other luminaries at 38204. Whether it was Chateau bottled Guinnesses or Phoenix Brewery Stout it was, or John Jamessan and Sons or Rube Coca-Cola. He also uses the famous initials of JJS, which we were talking about, or JJNS, with G and G's on 4205, 8303, like 4 and 7pence between hopping and trapping, which you might as well just have, boy bucks, to buy JJNS with, and Jake, Jack, and Little Sue Susie at 30824, which is
that a Shem, Sean, and Izzy kind of thing?
That's it. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So he always figures that away. He also loves to corrupt the term gleefully. He does so. 229.23. It's Jamassons, or 257.36. It's Fidge Fudgesons. At 325.17, John Jemsons. At 333.16, it's Jamisons. At 424.17, he starts playing with a name with John Jacobson before trying a Spanish alter ego at 470.33 with Juan Jameson Hastoluego. At and then we also hear about S. Sampson and Son at 523.16 and Sean Shempson Say When at 533.34. So, yeah, it's it's just everywhere throughout this, and it's one of those things where I thought, I'll pull the 6 or 7 references there'll be, and of course it's just cascades, and there's tons that I would have missed because he buried them even deeper than we thought. So So a question I have for you is, what is the future of whiskey? Like, what's next for Irish whiskey?
If you'd asked me a year ago, I probably would have given you a very different answer. I think there's a lot of uncertainty now. There was a big giddying, almost like a kind of a Wakean, uplift for a long time of kind of, we're reborn. The times couldn't be better. And now there's a lot of, kind of terms like market correction being passed around and blah, blah, blah. So I think it's not as, I think that the kind of honeymoon is kind of coming to an end. And now there were a lot of people who got in on it when it was doing well and had big forecasts of big successes. And there's a lot of people who had, I don't know, a dream of making whiskey, but not of selling it, and everything in between. So, it's in a strange, there's been a lot of bad news this week. It hasn't been, but there's been a lot of talk about, I think there's a core of authenticity in Irish whiskey that wasn't there or wasn't as visibly there this time 10 years ago. There's a lot of people who really think about it with a lot of genuine love for what they're making and what they're doing. It's not just about, again, back to the cliches, the selling whiskey. And that used to really irritate me about some of the ways that drink is sold, that there can be a lot of twee and there can be a lot of, but then there's also just wonderful people who make wonderful stuff and are really honestly interested in what they're doing. And I've crossed my fingers that they will be the survivors when all of this kind of, passes. But it's a strange, and it's funny because, like, again, when Joyce was writing, whiskey was just part of the fabric of Irish society. It was there. It was in the background. Right. It wasn't a willful thing to be resuscitated. Whereas now, like, even when I first started drinking whiskey, like, the people who were into whiskey were usually much older than me at the time, or if not much older, there were a lot of elderly people, and then there was like in between me and the kind of old fellas, there were kind of a tight-knit band of fanatics of all hobbyist drinkers, who were into it as a kind of a hobby. And now it has really proliferated even within Ireland in a much more grassroots way. I think it's lost a lot of its baggage, and I hope that'll continue. And the idea of whiskey being Irish is become more kind of tightly stitched, and that's less beholden to like the sales of the product at a given moment. So I think that will continue to really assert itself. And I see a lot of the eagerness. I think there's a thirsting for authenticity in Irish distilling at the moment. And you see it in the Putching revival as well. Because again, early on, the first legal Putchings, a lot of them used to be really twee as well and had these ridiculous names, and you saw them in gift shops and this kind of stuff. And now you've got people more honestly kind of saying, oh, well, this is, a process and I'm proud of what I'm making and blah, blah, blah. And there's a sense of, well, this is agrarian history and it's not just something in a mason jar with a funny label, duty free. And I think that is kind of a bit more self-protected against any sort of economic ups and downs, I do think the industry is not going back to where it was anytime soon. I think that bulwark is there.
There's this weird thing that's happening in America where whiskey by location is becoming kind of like this this thing to hang your hat on. Like Tennessee whiskey, like permeates and so much so that the idea of getting this certain bottle of Dickel whiskey for my father-in-law feels like this is the thing I have to do. He's like, I love this Tennessee whiskey. I'm from Texas, where we try to. For some reason, Texans love to just slap their name on anything and be like, it's Texan, therefore it's better, which is actively not true. I'm okay with saying that. But like, there's even a rise of trying to make Texas whiskey, which I'm like, what does that even mean? But yeah.
So like when I was talking about, Irish whiskey kind of rediscovering itself, Texas would be a good counter example where you do have this, there's some mad stuff happening in Texas with like, blue corn whiskey or like smoked, not with peat, but with Texas scrub and, Balcones and these kinds of people. And they're kind of, making an identity for themselves. And that can be fun and exhilarating in itself. And then you get the likes of, say, the Scotch whiskey industry or even the more Kentucky bourbon kind of industries where they have all the cards already, and Ireland is in a really odd place of like kind of not being either, and there's this sense of, and it's true for so many things in Irish culture, of this idea, this country loves a good chip on the shoulder, we and a sob story and a this and that, and it can send, and it starts to flow a bit quicker after a few glasses, so it's there. I think it's a reminder that it was for all, and I look, I spend my days around whiskey people, around people who make the stuff, people who sell it. And I think there really is a strong heart, in them and in it, that I did not feel when I first got into whiskey. And it's certain, and there's a lot of people who have discovered it and kind of fallen down the well. And it does, I think that's here to stay. I really do. I worry about the fate of the trade at the moment, but the culture is certainly a reawoken giant. It certainly had whiskey. It's like Tim Finnegan with the liquid spilled on him.
Yeah, it almost sounds like an equivalent to like the artisan or the craft beer. 5 years ago, everyone's like, craft beer is here to stay, and now they're like, actually, it's non-alcoholic. That's the fastest growing market. So like all those people are just shifting, trying to find ways to.
Yeah, there's uncertainty, whether, and again, it's like the Wake, they go from complete collapse to mythic rebirth and, confidence to kind of shaky, consideration, and we fall again, and then we rise again.
And come back again. Yeah, that's right.
And I think if the Wake has taught me anything, it's certainly to kind of grin and bear it with a laugh, that inevitable collapse and rebirth, and the building it up, and then and yes, it's saturated with the cliches and the bollocks and the uncertainties and all the other things, but at the same time, you kind of laugh along with it, and you'll find yourself going around in circles. Right. It lends itself.
Well, look, this has been fantastic, and you've given us so much to think about, and you've made this such a rich discussion, and we all raise a glass to Dave for, we wish he was here to join us in this discussion, but Fionnán, it's been sort of, it's just been incredible to hear your perspective and your wisdom and your expertise. We're definitely going to make sure we link out to all of your things so that people can find your books, and you have your Viva coming up.
Yes.
We wish you the best for that defense.
Well, if I can find it before,
yes,
I'll tell you where that book got its title. I was reading. Hold on. So this is where, and when I was talking about lines where you can really see that Joyce has at least a kind of a startlingly good amateur understanding of the process when he's talking about, and it's right at the beginning where, Anna Olivia has made her river journey out to the sea, and I always had this self-constructed thing about the distillation process of like literally it's water turning into vapor, turning back into water, which is the same process as rain, and that Anna Olivia herself follows the same trajectory. She, the river out to the sea, up into the clouds, then little Annie Rainey, and she comes back down, and she's going through this, her, and the fact that she is water, she's the water of life in her sense is the River Liffey. But at the beginning, he really understands that like yeast, fermentation, evaporation, and it's all there where you get and this is one of the mentions of the nickname créatúr that stuck with me. And I was reading this again, and that was when I decided to call the book créatúr. And it's funny because originally, even the way it was spelled, the kind of Hiberno English would be like Craythur. Right. And seeing that on the page, I thought, this looks really camp and cliche. It looks like something fucking Carol's, the gift shop chain in Ireland. Yeah. And then when I spelt it in Irish, it kind of divorced it a little bit so that it didn't feel quite so twee. And it also looks, the Irish would be like Creatur, and so it also looks a little more like the word creature. But where I finally got the confidence to kind of embrace this title was reading this and having this kind of epiphany of one kind or another about the rain itself. But big Mr. Finnegan of the stuttering hand, Freeman's Moor, lived in the broadest way imaginable. in his rushlet too far back for massages before Joshuan judges had given us numbers or Helviticus committed Deuteronomy. One yeasty day he sternly struck his teeth in a tub to watch the future of his fates, but ere he swiftly stuck it out again, by the might of Moses, the very water was evaporated, and all the Guinnesses had met their exodus, so that ought to show you what a pension juicy chap he was. And during mighty odd years, this man of hod, cement, and edifices on Toper's Thorpe piled building supra building upon the banks by the livers for the sowing by the sowing sow. He had a little fiffy Annie ugged the little crathur. With your hair and horns took up your partner. If that's not a reference to Gargle, I don't know what is. You know? And his yeasty head in a tub, the very water is evaporated, you know. The Guinnesses had met their exoduses, by the banks of the livers, by the sowing so. And then, the again, ALP makes her reappearance for, I think, one of the first, well, obviously it's in like the first few pages, but after her, and he had a little fiffy Annie is capitalized, there she is, and then ugged a little crathur, and again the bit of the book where the song is all over the place anyway. So
right.
that was the bit where I
isn't it beautiful?
I want to let you know something. You actually have just done the one thing that Toby wanted the entire podcast. He said, wouldn't it be great if we had someone from Ireland read a section of the book? And you have absolutely done so. Yeah. As it was happening, I got so excited. I was like, it's happening, Toby. It's happening.
Yes. We have a very select list of Irish people who've joined us, and you're at the very top of the list. So it's wonderful. Look, that is all the time we have this week for Wake. So thank you. It's been so great to have you here, Fionnán.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been terrific. Listeners, join us next week as we get back to the final reading episode of the series. We are getting toward the end, if you can believe it. So we wish you all a well-aged, smooth and delightful tipple and a restful and reflective St. Patrick's Day. Who are we kidding? But we really want to thank Finnegans O'Connor for joining us today. And I'll make sure I link out to all of your things on our show notes to make sure that people buy your book and look out for your new book. I also want to thank my writing partner, TJ Young. As always, as I'm getting emotional toward the end of this whole process, we're 50 episodes in just about, and sad that it's ending, but we've made some good stuff, and today is another classic. So thank you, TJ.
Yes, of course. And this is, next project's coming soon. Yes. We know it.
And just like we did on the Guinness episode, I also warmly invite the good people at Jamessan's or Powers, if they want to sponsor this episode, to please get in touch. We will happily brand this episode. So get on that. I'm going to tag Jamessan's in the Instagram post, and hopefully they'll accept the collaboration. The Guinness did not, so that's their loss, I guess. Thank you all. I've been Toby Malone, and thanks again for everyone for being here. We'll see you next week, sippers and suppers. This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegans Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegans Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegans Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.